Hello, my dear friends. Tonight we will step into a dark corner that even medieval history itself tries to avoid mentioning. An age that had no concept of a serial killer, no investigative science, no criminal records, a world where death dissolved into war, plague, and feudal power. And perhaps, as tonight's story unfolds, you will shiver at the truth about the killer. I am about to speak of a monster born not in the shadows, but right in the very centre of power, prestige, and reverence. And as always, before we begin the main content, don't forget to take a moment to leave a like and subscribe to Medieval Dreams. And if you're watching from anywhere in the world, leave a comment with your location, your local time, or even the weather there, so I know I always have you as a companion. Now then, turn off the lights, wrap yourself in a warm blanket, and let us ease our way into tonight's journey together. In 15th century Brittany, when night fell, people closed their doors earlier than usual. Not because they feared wolves, not because they feared bandits, but because of a silent terror. Poor children were disappearing around Mashekul Castle, one by one, without a trace. They did not vanish in war, nor from illness. It was an absolute disappearance, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed them whole. In the small surrounding villages you can imagine the strange silence each time a poor family realised their youngest child had not returned after doing odd jobs, or after going out to beg for food. The mother would panic, running from house to house, calling the child's name in despair. The father would search the barren fields, look down into the cold streams, hoping it was merely some accident. Fragile hope everyone knew was a lie. Villagers whispered among themselves, but no one dared say anything aloud. In that feudal society, careless words could lead to suspicion, punishment, or worse, being accused of slandering the nobility. Yet fear still spread, thin but stubborn as heavy morning fog. There is something in Gilles de Rais's castle. The first rumours were as small as a breath. Someone said they had once seen a castle servant leading a young boy away to do light work. Another said they had heard faint screams in the night. But there were even more chilling accounts, that children were lured into the castle with promises of food, clothing, or work, and behind those heavy stone doors they never came out again. What paralysed people with fear was not only the number of missing children, but where it all happened. Right under the shadow of a castle belonging to one of the most powerful men in France at the time, Gilles de Rais, a nobleman, a knight who had fought beside Joan of Arc, a man praised as a religious hero. No one wanted to believe that darkness could lie just behind such dazzling glory. Yet suspicion kept swelling quietly with every missing child. In rural taverns, where men drank to forget the harshness of winter, you could hear old farmers telling stories in low, trembling voices. He followed the castle's man and never returned. Or, I swear, there were cries coming from that direction. Each story added another layer to the fear compressed inside the community, a fear shapeless yet unmistakable. Women warned their sons not to go outside after sunset, not even to visit a friend. Older children avoided the path leading to Machakul as if it were cursed, and on late afternoons, when the sun slid behind a lead-coloured horizon, an entire village seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if another child would not return that night. Though everyone sensed something was wrong, no one dared accuse outright. No one touched the name Gilles de Rais, a name too large, too powerful, too sacred in the eyes of the church and the king. How could someone like him possibly be linked to such horrifying disappearances? Perhaps the most frightening thing was not the missing children, but the silence. Silence at poor dinner tables, Silence during church services when the priest glossed over the lost children. Silence in the castle itself when servants shut the heavy doors. Silence made everyone feel that something was terribly wrong, but also made them too afraid to confront the truth, and so the story spread as murmurs. There is something in that castle, something we're not meant to know. A vague yet persistent dread, like an invisible hand squeezing the heart of a once peaceful countryside. In the Middle Ages, countless tragedies went unrecorded. Children died of illness, hunger, war, accidents, but disappearances following the same pattern, same age, same poverty, same area, were no longer coincidence. They became a question hanging over the people. Who is behind this? And why does no one dare speak out? It was in that setting that the shadow of Gilles de Rais began to take shape, not as a holy knight, not as a charming noble, but as a darkening mystery spreading from within a castle, a mystery that, if you approached even slightly, would send a chill racing down your spine. In a feudal world where laws were written by the powerful and fear was cultivated in poor households, facing the truth was far more terrifying than the darkness itself. But as with all buried crimes, what happened around Machecoul could not remain hidden forever. The missing children were the call of truth, a truth that Brittany would eventually have to face, no matter how dark, no matter how impossible it seemed that a human being could do such things. If the rumours about the children disappearing around Machecoul Castle were only faint echoes drifting across the Breton fields, then at the very heart of that castle, beneath layers of cold stone, beyond a series of locked doors, another secret had existed for many years. A secret that, once revealed, made all of France in 1440 shudder. Gilles de Rais had his own torture chamber, where his crimes were not acts of impulse but a carefully organised ritual. The court documents of the time, though written in cautious language and bearing the solemn tone of the church, still could not hide the horror of the truth. Each recorded line left even historians shocked. Luring children, abuse, torture, mistreatment, murder, and the disposal of bodies. A chain of acts carried out repeatedly, methodically, like a dark religious rite. And the most terrifying thing was not each individual act, but the way they were carried out as if they were merely a routine part of the castle's daily life. According to the testimonies of the servants, Henrit and Poitou, children were brought into the castle with very simple promises: a hot meal, a few coins, or the chance to work in the kitchen. In a poor rural region, such promises were more tempting than anything else. No one imagined that behind those stone walls existed a world opposite to the splendour and moral virtue Gilles tried to display in public. Once the great doors of the castle closed, the fate of those children was sealed. Henriette testified that he had watched his master choose victims as though selecting new toys, assessing them by appearance, age, body, with absolute indifference to their humanity. From there, the victims were taken down to the deepest level of the castle, a small room with thick stone walls where no cry for help could pierce through to the outside world. This was the secret torture chamber. The court records describe the room in only a few brief sentences, but enough to convey that it was entirely cut off from the world above. A thick wooden door, flickering torchlight, and an atmosphere that witnesses described as stifling and dense. Stifling not only because of the lack of air, but because of what had taken place there for years. Here Gilles began his ritual. The court described his actions in restrained words, yet every phrase carried horror. Children were lured into the room. They were abused. They were tortured in various ways, and then they were killed. Not killed swiftly to end suffering, but killed as part of a ritual, where the perpetrator sought to prolong fear, wanting to see the soul leave the body. According to Poitou's exact testimony, some statements said that at times Gilles behaved as though performing a sacred ceremony. The children were washed, their hair brushed, dressed in clean clothes, given a final meal. Everything resembled preparation for a solemn event, except that it was a ceremony of death. After the brutality ended, the bodies were disposed of in complete silence throughout the castle. Some were burned, some buried within the inner courtyard, some crushed so thoroughly that no trace remained. On those nights, the smoke from the castle's hearth rose unusually high, but no one dared ask. No one dared speak. No one dared question a nobleman who possessed his own private army. That was why the crimes continued year after year, and when they were finally uncovered, the number of victims was estimated by the court to be between 80 and 200. Some historians believe the number may have been even higher, but history can only rely on what remains. The consistent testimonies of the servants, the evidence found within the castle, and the fact that children in the region had been disappearing for nearly a decade. So what allowed this system of crimes to exist for so many years? The answer lies not inside the torture chamber, but within the social structure of the age. Gilles de Rais was a high-ranking noble, wealthy, among the most powerful men in Brittany. He had fought alongside Joan of Arc, been knighted, and was praised as a national hero. A man like that, in the eyes of medieval people, stood almost above the law. In a world where power and lineage determined everything, no one dared question him, no one dared investigate. Rumours about missing children were dismissed as the misfortunes of a poor countryside, and when a family lost a child, all they could do was pray. They would never dare approach the gates of the castle to ask questions. Local authorities? Most were Gilles' own men. The church? There was no clear evidence, and it was too consumed with internal conflicts. The servants? Terrified, because they knew that anyone who spoke would share the victim's fate. This silence formed a perfect suit of armour that protected Gilles for nearly a decade, and within that silence the secret torture chamber continued to exist, like a living creature, devouring one child at a time. In the darkness of Machecoul Castle, the horrifying crimes of Gilles de Rais were never the actions of a lone man. Around him was a network of accomplices, people both fearful and dependent, those who had seen too much, known too much, yet remained silent for far too long. The most prominent names among them were Henriette and Poitou, his two trusted attendants, who would later become crucial witnesses in the entire case, and also the men who helped extend the cold-blooded sequence of deaths for many years. They said that the act of taking children was sometimes heartbreakingly simple. Some were lured with a piece of bread, with the promise of work, with sweet words that any child, living in poverty and deprivation, would find easy to believe. At other times they were dragged away just after leaving church or while playing near the village gate. Everything happened quickly, discreetly, like a passing shadow that vanished moments later. And once the doors of the castle closed, no one outside knew what awaited the children within. Henriette and Poitou, in their confessions, described themselves as men who cleaned up, prepared the room, stood guard, or even directly assisted in the brutal rituals. Every small action, carrying torches, holding doors, disposing of bodies, was another link in the smoothly running machinery of Gilles' crimes. None of them dared refuse, because in that castle, the master's power was not only absolute, it could smother any cry for help. Their silence in itself spoke volumes about the strength of the feudal system. Gilles was not merely a lord, he was a man with a private army, vast lands, deep political ties, a warrior who had fought alongside Joan of Arc and been hailed as a national hero. In the eyes of his servants, he was nothing short of a living sovereign, and to defy the command of a sovereign was no different from signing one's own death warrant. So silence was not a choice, it was a survival instinct. People today often ask, why didn't they run? Why didn't they report him? But that is the question of the modern world, where the law has shape, where justice does not entirely lie in the hands of the wealthy. In the Middle Ages, especially in the wild, fragmented, feudal lands of Brittany, accusing a baron was tantamount to uttering a suicidal curse. Servants were the lowest born in the castle hierarchy, with no land, no rights, and nowhere to go. They lived on their master's breath, and their deaths could be so swift that no one bothered to record them. And so, over the years, the law of silence became an invisible net cast over the entire castle. Fear stopped people from speaking. But familiarity, the terrible familiarity of repeated horror, stopped them from even wanting to speak. Thus the crimes became a habit of the darkness, a habit only dragged into the light when the final confessions were ripped from the trembling throats of the servants at the 1440 trial. When Henriette stood before the judges, it was recorded that he cried, not tears of repentance, but the tears of a man who'd been pulled into the vortex of power for so long that he could no longer distinguish the line between obeying orders and committing crimes. Poitou shook uncontrollably as he described how he had held arms, held legs, held doors, while his master did things he himself had never dared to name. Both of them, when pressed, repeated a single truth. We feared him. No one dared oppose him. And that fear created the perfect shield for Gilles. No cry ever escaped the castle. No whisper ever reached the neighbouring towns. Children continued to disappear, but the poor were too familiar with loss to chase the truth to its end, and those within the castle were trapped in a circle of power, guilt, and resignation. This system was not built overnight, nor from a single command. It was nourished by fear seeping through each stone of the castle, by the cruelty its owner had brought back from the battlefield, by the arbitrary rewards or punishments that taught the servants their lives were worth less than Gilles' slightest word. And so this network of accomplices, though not willing, became the backbone of the crimes. None of them killed out of the same twisted pleasure as Gilles, but their silence, the silence they were forced to keep for so many years, gave him the space he needed to cultivate his horrors. When the case finally broke open, when the testimonies were written in black ink on parchment, people realized that Gilles' crimes were not merely the crimes of one man. They were the crimes of an age in which power could bend justice, where fear served as law, and where a feudal castle could become the prison of countless small, fragile souls, simply because no one dared speak. In that dreadful silence, Gilles de Rais was never alone, and that is precisely what makes his crimes colder than any stone chamber in Machecoul Castle. For many years the poor children of Brittany disappeared quietly, silently, like fallen leaves swept into a stream. The people could only whisper among themselves, casting fearful glances toward Machecoul Castle, yet no one dared to voice aloud what they suspected. The power of Gilles de Rais, a wealthy nobleman once a war hero, hung over the land like a long shadow no one dared to touch. And then, on a morning heavy with the smell of candle wax, a small yet reckless mistake by one of his subordinates shattered the long-standing silence. That day the local church was more crowded than usual. Children were brought in by their parents to attend the service, standing around the altar, hands clasped as they recited simple, innocent lines of prayer. The priest was preparing to deliver his final sermon. The flickering candlelight danced across the statues of saints, creating the familiar, solemn stillness known to every parishioner. And it was in that seemingly peaceful moment that evil showed its face for the first time, not in darkness, not in the forest path, but right there in the holiest place of the community, the main altar. A strange man stepped forward from the back. His cloak was worn, his manner rushed though he tried to appear calm. He slipped between rows of people, his eyes fixed on a frail boy standing close to the altar, perhaps because the child liked being near where the priest read the prayers. As the hymn faded, the man bent down, placed his large hand on the boy's shoulder and yanked him sharply. A piercing scream erupted at once. The priest spun around, the parishioners nearby froze, and in those first few seconds, before fear replaced shock, everyone saw clearly. The child was being dragged away from the altar, as though he were some abandoned object. The church had always been the one place where the poor believed their children were safe. For such a thing to happen right there was nothing less than a blow to the last shred of trust they held. The priest rushed forward at once. He grabbed the man's sleeve, pulling him back, shouting over the sound of crying children and gasping adults. The kidnapper tried to run, but it was too late. A few strong men threw themselves at him, holding him down. They wrestled in chaos. The boy was pulled into the arms of another parishioner, clutched tightly. Only when the man's hood fell off did true horror spread through the church. He was not a stranger. He was a servant of Machecoul Castle, a man many villagers had seen accompanying the retinue of Gilles de Rais. A truth that everyone had tried to deny suddenly became sharp as a blade. The missing children had not been taken by wolves, had not run away, had not died by accident. They had been abducted, and their captor came from the castle. The priest hesitated no longer. Until that very moment, the local clergy had taken a lenient stance toward the rumours. But this event, unfolding before their eyes, right at the altar, made it impossible for him to turn away and pray for comfort. He immediately reported the incident to the bishop of the diocese of Nantes. In the trial records of 1440, this event was described as a clear sign of wrongdoing, the moment that forced the church to launch an official investigation. Years earlier, they had received occasional accusations that children were lured into the castle with promises of work that many never returned. But no one dared confront a wealthy nobleman with a private army who had once stood beside Joan of Arc in battle. Such accusations were dismissed as desperate rumours from poor peasants. But an attempted kidnapping in a church was entirely different. It tore the veil of silence. It challenged the sacred authority of the church. And above all, it forced the bishop to admit that continuing to remain silent was no different from aiding evil. The day the news reached Nantes, the bishop ordered an immediate investigation. A religious commission was sent to Machecoul, carrying the authority to interrogate, gather testimony, and summon anyone involved. They spoke to villagers, listening to accounts of missing children. They spoke to the families of boys who had never returned from the castle. All those isolated stories, once thought unrelated, began to connect into a chilling chain of truth. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that the disappearances were not coincidences, but a system that had lasted for years, a system previously hidden beneath the reputation of Gilles de Rais, a commander once praised by King Charles VII. The attempted kidnapping in the church was like a hairline crack in a wall that seemed unbreakable. But once the church's hammer struck the first blow, the other stones began to fracture, and for the first time in many years the people felt that the darkness within Machecoul Castle was no longer untouchable. The bishop sent a full report to the secular court, along with an official accusation, an inquiry into Gilles de Rais for child abduction. It was only the first step. but also the decisive one that opened the greatest investigation of the 15th century. Not because Gilles' crimes were unprecedented, but because there was finally an undeniable piece of evidence, witnessed by dozens, in the holiest place of all. There was no longer any way for the crown or the church to look away. A little boy, nearly dragged from the altar of God, had, by accident, become the catalyst that exposed a monster protected by the armour of feudal power. And from that moment on, the history of Gilles de Rais veered into a path from which there was no return. After the attempted kidnapping of the boy right before the altar, the atmosphere in Brittany changed completely. A fear that had smouldered for years suddenly became tangible, sharp as the sound of iron locks scraping against each other in the night. And when the bishop's report reached the secular court, everything unfolded faster than anyone expected. For the first time, the authority of the church and that of the civil powers stood side by side against a nobleman. Gilles de Rais, commander, hero who had once fought beside Joan of Arc, was no longer untouchable. In September 1440, the Duke of Brittany's forces and the Bishop of Nantes' men united to surround Gilles' castles. For the first time in many years, the high stone walls of Machecoul, long rumoured to hide unspeakable secrets, had to face the light of the law. Doors that had opened only for nobles and servants were now smashed in by soldiers, and what they found inside chilled even the most hardened warriors. Locked rooms, ropes, instruments of torment, marks on the walls that could not be explained away by any harmless excuse. In several accounts, soldiers said they found children's clothing, tiny shoes and old toys, like scattered fragments of memory existing in a place where they absolutely should not. There were no intact corpses, but the evidence of crime lay everywhere in its own terrible way. Yet the physical evidence was only one part. The true collapse began when Gilles' most loyal servants were arrested and questioned. Henriette and Poitou, the men who had followed Gilles in nearly everything, quickly became central to the investigation. Under the pressure of the church, confronted with irrefutable evidence and the prospect of being burned alive for complicity, they began to confess. Their confessions sliced open the protective veil surrounding their once powerful master. They told how children were lured to the castle with promises of work, food, or new clothes. They spoke of rituals that lasted through the night. They described the horror in the locked chambers, the smothered cries, and the disposal of bodies by burning or hurried burials in the castle courtyard. Their accounts matched so perfectly that there was no room left for doubt. The people of Brittany, upon hearing these testimonies, described themselves with two words: frozen stiff. For them, the truth was too cruel to accept, yet too clear to deny. The man once praised beside Joan of Arc during the liberation of Orléans, once hailed by the court as a protector of the kingdom, had in fact been hiding a darkness no legend had ever dared to tell. At this point, Gilles de Rais was no longer merely suspected, and he became the centre of the greatest investigation of the 15th century, for the scandal touched not only his personal crimes, but also the very image of the nobility and the foundations of feudal order. The secular authorities acted swiftly. The church joined in as well, not only because of the gruesome nature of the crimes, but because of the sacrilege committed by abducting a child inside a church. This was something the Vatican could not ignore. The two systems, long rivals for power, now united with one goal: to expose the monster hiding behind the title of knight. In the 1440 court files, one bishop wrote, "The testimonies are so consistent, it is as though one single person were recounting them." This shows the disturbing extent to which the confessions aligned, each witness describing a different part of the machine of cruelty that Gilles had built. But what chilled Brittany more than anything was Gilles' reaction upon being arrested. Records describe him as showing no panic, no pleading, no denial. In the first days, he even appeared offended at being investigated, like a gentleman whose honour had been insulted, rather than a man accused of murdering hundreds of children. That very attitude twisted the image of the holy knight the court had once painted of him, a man once honoured for his military achievements, once clad in bright armour beside Jeanne d'Arc, now revealed a face history had never seen before. The search phase was horrifying not only for the testimonies and the physical remnants, but for the way everything fit together like pieces of a giant mosaic. The missing children, the ropes, the locked rooms, the servants' confessions, and the long silence of the villagers, all pointing in one direction. In the end, a sentence that appeared again and again in late 1440 documents became the unavoidable conclusion. The holy knight Gilles de Rais no longer exists. Falling at once were his prestige, his titles, his wartime glory, and the majestic image he had built when fighting alongside Jeanne d'Arc. What remained was a stripped-down man standing at the centre of a spiral of investigation, with nothing left to hide. The authorities and the church continued to dig deeper, but the greatest truth had already emerged from the moment Gilles' castles were besieged. The mask of a hero had fallen, revealing the true face of the most notorious child killer of the Middle Ages, and from then on, the case was no longer a rumour whispered among peasants. It became a terror officially inscribed into the records of history. When Gilles de Rais was brought to Nantes in the autumn of 1440, the whole of Brittany seemed to hold its breath. Not everyone dared squeeze into the square to see the true face of a man once hailed as a national hero. But every door was left ajar, every kitchen fell silent, all attention fixed on a single question: were the horrifying rumours true? This trial was, quite literally, the moment when European history was forced to confront a concept that would only be named centuries later: the serial killer. Up until then, killing in the Middle Ages was everywhere. War, pillage, famine, public executions. But a long-term pattern of organised murders targeting children, repeated over many years with disturbing consistency, carried out by a nobleman of great renown, had no precedent. On the day the trial opened, witnesses described Gilles entering in luxurious clothing, with a composure so chilling it seemed unnatural. He did not tremble, beg, nor protest his innocence. Some even reported that he looked annoyed at being treated like a criminal. Opposite him sat representatives of the church and the secular authorities in 2 long rows. Unusual not because they appeared together, but because it was the first time they joined forces to prosecute someone from the very class they normally protected. The indictment was read aloud, long as a dark epic poem, luring children, child abuse, torture, murder, dismemberment, burning of bodies, destruction of evidence, the orchestration of depraved rituals. Those dreadful words echoed through the stone chamber, rising into the vaulted ceiling as though the very hall recoiled at what was being described. When the servants Henriette and Poitou stepped forward, the courtroom fell silent. Under oath before the church, they recounted how children were enticed with promises of work or food, how their bodies were abused, killed and disposed of, how everything followed a repeated ritual that had lasted for years. What the court never forgot was the terrifying consistency of their testimonies, each man describing one part, yet together forming a single coherent narrative without contradiction. That is why modern historians, though cautious about all medieval trials, find it difficult to dismiss the case's authenticity. Then came Gilles' turn to speak, and the atmosphere grew even colder. No tears, No pleas, no denials. He confessed, not vaguely, but with a level of detail that made several clerics lower their heads to avoid his gaze. Some accounts say he spoke of certain acts as though describing a hunt. Calm, even boastful, this led to the famous question: was he forced to confess? Yet 3 key factors almost completely rule out that possibility. His confession matched the servants' testimonies. His descriptions aligned with the physical evidence found in the castles, and he confessed before both the secular and ecclesiastical courts, 2 independent systems, making it nearly impossible to coordinate a unified fabricated narrative. What was far more disturbing was his demeanour. Calm to the point of numbness, articulate to a suspicious degree without remorse or fear. At that moment, everyone in the courtroom understood they were not witnessing a man guilty of manslaughter, nor a wronged nobleman, but a profoundly distorted mind, a prototype of what later centuries would call a serial killer. News from the courtroom swept through the marketplace like wind. The people of Brittany had long suspected something behind the disappearances, but never imagined the true scale of the crimes. In an age when death by war, disease or famine was familiar, deliberate, ritualistic child murder repeated over years was beyond comprehension. Many began calling him a demon. Some priests whispered that he had sold his soul long ago. Though interpretations varied, everyone agreed Gilles de Rais was the first clearly documented serial killer in European history. As the final days of the trial approached, no mask could hide the truth any longer. Testimony, evidence, confession, all arranged like the stone sealing a crypt. The court pronounced the death sentence. No one rejoiced at the verdict. There was only the heavy silence of people who had just glimpsed a dark chapter of humanity. A nobleman once celebrated as a hero beneath Joan of Arc's banner now stood exposed as a monster who slaughtered children. And when the prison door closed after the verdict, European history closed one of its most unprecedented cases, leaving behind a shadow that historians and criminologists still examine today. Gilles de Rais, the first serial killer ever recorded in the chronicles. That fateful morning, the sky over Nantes hung grey and low, like a long funereal veil stretched above the people of Brittany. It was said that no one in the region wished to miss the final moments of Gilles de Rais, the man who had once ridden beside Jeanne d'Arc, once praised as the very symbol of courage, but now exposed as a monster who slaughtered children. When the guards opened the city gate, the crowd surged toward the execution ground with such force that people had to jostle for any glimpse of the gallows. The elderly standing beneath the trees whispered, "Who could have believed a nobleman capable of such things?" While children hid behind their mothers' skirts, afraid to look directly at the scene being prepared. In the centre of the square stood a tall gallows, and beside it a pyre stacked high with dry wood. This double punishment was not intended to prolong his suffering, but to ensure that no part of his remains might ever be revered or preserved as relics. According to several records, the people of Brittany wanted the fire as well, as a way to cleanse the land, to chase away the spectre of the crimes that had haunted them in silence for so many years. Gilles de Rais stepped forward, not bound like a common criminal, but permitted to wear an elegant black cloak and a silk cap. People were astonished to see that he neither trembled nor raged nor panicked. On the contrary, he smiled faintly, a smile that made the onlookers shudder. He bowed to the priest and received absolution, a ritual even the most ordinary murderers longed for. And it was this calmness that made the truth even harder for the crowd to bear. How could a man kill hundreds of children and still look so composed? Records from Nantes recount that he ascended the scaffold with the poise of someone attending an important court ceremony rather than being led to execution. The noose tightening around his neck did not alter his expression. Some murmured that he welcomed death, that after so many years hiding in the shadows of his crimes, he had grown weary, and the only choice left was to face the end. Others believed he was unafraid because he thought himself forgiven, that this confidence was the last remnant of his feudal pride. When the soldier kicked the stool from beneath his feet, the crowd held its breath. His large frame swung in the air, the rope scraping against his neck with a dry, rasping sound. But his body hardly struggled, something that deeply unsettled those watching. In the reports from that time, someone wrote, "He died like a knight, yet lived like a demon." And it was this contradiction that made his crimes all the more incomprehensible to those who witnessed his final moments. Once the body fell limp, the soldiers cut it down and laid it upon the pyre. The smell of burning resin drifted on the wind as flames licked at the edge of his black cloak. It was then that the people who once believed him a hero stepped back, as if the fire were also consuming the most cherished memories they held of him. No one spoke, no one cheered at his death. That silence, deep, heavy, and prolonged, stamped the execution into history as a tragedy rather than an act of vengeance. Only when the flames rose high, crackling through the stacked timber, did someone in the crowd murmur, "A nobleman can be a devil too, Miss Cora." It was the first time, and perhaps the only time, the people of Brittany dared say out loud what they had long only thought in secret, that rank and heraldry do not make a man moral, that even the grandest castle may conceal an abyss they could never have imagined. Strangely, many accounts mention that Gilles' household servants wept as the pyre blazed, not because he was innocent, but because after years of living in silence they were finally freed from the curse of the master they served. A few priests even prayed for his soul, a gesture that sparked heated debate at the time. Yet they did so because doctrine demanded belief in the possibility of salvation, even for a man whose crimes had horrified the world. The burning lasted for many hours. When the fire finally died, a small portion of the ashes was given to his relatives. The rest was buried at the execution ground. No gravestone, no inscription. A brutally simple end for a man who had once possessed numerous castles, estates, and armies. That day the people of Brittany returned home with a heavy feeling. They took no joy in justice done. They felt only fear at the truth that someone so powerful could hide a monster beneath the armour of a knight. And in that silence, a new realization took shape, that in the Middle Ages the most terrifying thing was not war or plague, but the people shielded by prestige and authority to the point that no one dared ask what they were doing in the dark. The execution of Gilles de Rais did not simply end a life. It closed a false legend, exposing a tragedy that feudal society had allowed to survive for far too long. And from that day onwards, no one looked at the nobility as models of virtue again. For once, a hero's mask has burned to ash. The only truth that remains is this. Sometimes the most frightening demon is the one who is praised the loudest. Gilles de Rais' childhood, the childhood of the man who would later become the most infamous murderer of the Middle Ages, did not begin with deprivation or poverty, but with a paradoxical mixture: too much power, too many privileges, and a complete absence of emotional protection. Gilles was born into an old noble family of Brittany, a world where feudal authority, pride of bloodline, and an obsession with honour ran deep through every meal, every festival, every prayer. Yet that childhood did not last long. At the age of just 11, Gilles lost his father in a sudden hunting accident, and his mother died soon afterwards. The boy was left in the care of his grandfather, a man powerful and wealthy, but also frighteningly ruthless and ambitious. According to several accounts, it was in his grandfather's castle that Gilles first learned the most dangerous lesson of his life, that those belonging to the noble class did not bear responsibility before the law the way others did. It was not a statement taught directly like a moral precept. It seeped into his daily life through lavish banquets, through land disputes settled by threats, and through the silence of servants. Gilles grew up in an environment where power was not merely an advantage, it was an absolute shield. A single word from his family could determine the fate of a peasant, a village, or even an entire region. And for a child who had just suffered immense loss, that power brought no comfort. It merely created a dangerous void between him and the concept of accountability. In the memories surrounding Gilles, few mention moments of childish joy. Instead, they speak of a noble boy led to political negotiations, disputes over inheritance, and combat training far too early for his age. His grandfather wanted to mould him into a perfect political instrument, and to do so he spared no effort in forging in Gilles a hardened, cold, and utterly obedient servant of the family's ambitions. But this upbringing lacked the most important thing, compassion. With no mother's hand to care for him, no moments of permitted vulnerability, Gilles grew up materially indulged yet emotionally starved, something later researchers would consider the most dangerous psychological foundation of all. Several records describe troubling signs from early childhood. Gilles had a tendency to torment animals, behaviours that, within a feudal context, adults often dismissed as normal, even laughing that it is the strong nature of a future warrior. No one saw it as a warning. No one stopped to ask why a child took pleasure in the suffering of another living creature. In a society accustomed to slaughter on the battlefield, to hunting and public punishments, such behaviour was not alarming. Yet it planted the first seed of a distorted psychology, a seed that would later bloom into a nightmare for an entire region. Alongside the violence, Gilles was raised on lessons about the superiority of noble blood. His grandfather repeatedly emphasized that their family was not bound by the laws imposed on common folk. For a child who had lost both parents and felt adrift in the world, that emphasis became his only psychological anchor. Gilles began to believe he was different, that all his desires were justified, that gratifying himself was the natural right of someone from a higher caste, and that dangerous belief became the root of every warped act that followed. As he entered adolescence, Gilles' grandfather began shaping him for politics and war. He learned to ride early, trained with sword and lance, and took part in family negotiations. Yet parallel to this training was isolation. Gilles was not allowed to play with peasant children, nor to form friendships outside the noble class. He grew up within a tight, ambitious circle of power, and it slowly detached him from reality. When everyone around you exists solely to serve you, no one remains truly human in your eyes. Some historians argue that this isolated environment prevented Gilles from developing empathy, something every healthy society expects of a child. But Gilles' childhood was not shaped solely by power and flawed education. It was also marked by psychological shocks that few children could ever fully recover from. Orphaned too young, with no emotional refuge, and caught in the political machinations of adults, Gilles lived in constant insecurity. That insecurity, instead of pushing him toward empathy, twisted into a need for control. Gilles began craving absolute power over everything around him, from animals to servants, and later to the children he dragged into his secret chamber. None of this is meant to excuse the crimes Gilles committed later, but to understand that the shadow of the monster appeared very early, rooted in the environment that shaped him, in the imbalance between power and affection, in the warped lessons passed down through generations of feudal life. He was not born a monster, but his childhood, chaotic, wounded, and skewed, created the fertile soil in which darkness grew, silently, steadily, until no one was left strong enough to stop it. Gilles de Rais's youth turned a new page not through peaceful maturity, but through the sound of hooves, the smell of gunpowder, and the brilliant glow of the 100 Years' War. While many adolescents of his age were still occupied with seasonal festivals, Gilles was already wearing armour, walking the path of a true warrior, and that destiny brought him to stand beside one of the greatest figures Europe would ever remember, Jeanne d'Arc. The appearance of this 17-year-old peasant girl, a young woman who claimed she heard the voice of God, was the gust of wind that rekindled the hope of an exhausted France. And among the hundreds of nobles, soldiers and knights who followed her, Gilles de Rais was one of those who stood closest. It was here, amid the drums of war and fluttering holy banners, that Gilles first tasted the true meaning of military glory. He fought bravely, recklessly, even with a brutality that later made some historians wonder, was it loyalty or the exhilaration of someone born to live in violence? During the campaign to relieve Orléans in 1429, the pivotal event that revived all of France, Gilles fought side by side with Jeanne in the harshest days. Many accounts describe him as a stalwart commander, someone who charged into the front lines without hesitation, using strength and ferocity to clear the way for his comrades. English archers did not deter him, nor did the artillery. He used violence as the only language the world of that time seemed to understand, and in the eyes of many contemporaries, that was the mark of a hero. Thanks to successive victories, Gilles was granted titles, land, and was appointed Marshal of France, a position reserved only for the most outstanding warriors. At an age when many had not yet left their home villages, Gilles had already become a military icon, a shining figure within the royal court. Crowds cheered him, the king valued him, nobles feared and admired him. And at this moment, a dangerous notion began to take root in Gilles' mind, the sense of being invincible. But the glory of war always walks hand in hand with its darkness. Though praised as a hero, Gilles also soon became a witness to the most horrifying sights. Comrades shot down before his eyes, bodies piled high at the foot of fortress walls, children swept away in chaotic migrations, maimed corpses abandoned on the battlefield. For a teenager raised among violence, war did not evoke fear. It brought familiarity. His childhood home had taught him that power came from suppressing the fear of others. The battlefield taught him this lesson a second time, deeper and absorbed into the core of his nature. Jeanne d'Arc, his closest companion during those glorious days, was eventually captured, tried, and burned at the stake. When the flames consumed her in 1431, Gilles was left facing a void no victory could fill. Some historians believe Jeanne's tragedy was the psychological blow that silently pushed him away from the military path and towards the darkness he later embraced. For Jeanne embodied sanctity, while Gilles, for the rest of his life, would sink into its absolute opposite. After Jeanne's death, Gilles continued to fight, but the glory was no longer the same. The later battles brought victories and fame, but not the spiritual fervour he had known while following Jeanne. And at the same time, the violent nature forged too early and too intensely began slipping out of control, once he no longer had a battlefield to release it upon. The return of peace was good news for France, but it left an existential void for Gilles, a man who had grown accustomed to chaos, shouting and bloodshed throughout his youth. In less than 20 years, Gilles had gone from a traumatized child to a young warrior wielding power to a celebrated figure of the royal court. That abrupt transition, added to the heavy memories of war, made his psychological foundation unstable. Many historians argue that this period shaped the danger within Gilles. He was exalted as a hero while absorbing violence like breath itself, and when the light of war faded, the darkness inside him no longer remained dormant. It waited only for an opportunity to rise. Looking back on this period, one sees the bitter irony. Gilles de Rais was once regarded as the spearhead of France, someone willing to sacrifice himself for the country. Yet it was this very man who would later become the most terrifying symbol of medieval depravity. His military achievements did not disappear. They merely became thin layers of gold covering an abyss that, once the times changed, no one could control. That is the greatest paradox of Gilles de Rais. War gave him strength, fame, and reverence, yet it also planted within him the seeds of chaos and brutality. When there were no longer enemy cavalry to confront, no fortresses to storm, no cheers of soldiers to accompany him, Gilles began seeking something else to satisfy the turmoil within. And what he found, later on, was the crime history would never forget. After the glory of war had faded, Gilles de Rais entered a phase that historians describe with some of the most tragic and frightening words imaginable: collapse, superstition, and ultimately a freefall into darkness. If the battlefield had once given him a purpose to live, even if that purpose was built on blood and violence, then peace exposed a vast emptiness that he was utterly incapable of facing. And from that emptiness, all depravity began. In the years after the 100 Years' War, Gilles spent money as if the world could never run dry. His lands were vast, his titles valuable, his war rewards so great that people in contemporary France believed the de Rais lineage could never go poor. Yet Gilles burned through his wealth at a pace no one could fathom. He created extravagant theatrical productions that today would perhaps only be affordable to royalty. Stages built of precious wood, costumes laced with gold, large orchestras, hundreds of actors. All of it simply to satisfy his desire for spectacle, and to escape the monotonous reality of a nobleman with no war left in which to prove himself a hero. His reckless spending caused his fortune to crumble quickly. To maintain such lavishness, he sold land, sold family heirlooms, even sold holy objects from churches, an act considered a grave sin by medieval standards. The more he lost, the more desperately he sought to recover what he had squandered. And at this moment he turned to the same thing that many decaying nobles of the medieval world clung to: alchemy. Alchemy was not merely a game for fools. In the 15th century, many people, from nobles to scholars, believed one could turn base metals into gold, or create the elixir of life, a potion for immortality. But for Gilles, alchemy was not scientific curiosity. It was a promised salvation, the last lifeline for a man sinking to the bottom. He hired self-proclaimed sorcerers, poured money into buying equipment, and turned his castle into a chaotic workshop smelling of sulphur and burning metal. But what made this period truly dark was not alchemy. It was demon summoning. In the court records of 1440, one name appears repeatedly: Baron or Baron, a being Gilles believed could bring him gold if he offered his soul. The wandering magicians he hired, especially Etienne Corillot, known as Poitiers, convinced him that a demon-summoning ritual could provide limitless wealth. And Gilles, in desperation and delusion, was willing to try. The demon-summoning rituals in Mashikal Castle were not baseless rumours. Court records describe in detail how Gilles instructed the magicians to prepare talismans, sacrifices, spellbooks, even to use blood to draw summoning circles. Some nights he wore a black cloak, pacing around the great hall like a man unhinged, muttering incantations that mixed Latin with Old French, words he believed would call Baron forth. But Baron never appeared. Instead came a blind disappointment, and from that disappointment Gilles' mind began slipping away from the boundaries of reason. Some modern historians analyse this period as showing signs of personality disorder, compounded by war trauma and a growing sense of losing control. But to people of the time, what they saw was a nobleman approaching the brink of madness, a man who had lost all moral and spiritual grounding. Gilles' life became a sequence of bizarre contradictions. By day he organised church ceremonies and gave alms to maintain a saintly image. By night he locked the castle doors, lit red candles, and took part in occult rituals. This continued for months, even years, before he entered the peak of his crimes. The more his summoning rituals failed, the more furious Gilles became. According to the servant's testimony, he grew increasingly violent, quick to anger, and began demanding stronger sacrifices, a detail that historians believe laid the psychological groundwork for his later crimes involving children. Records show that in Gilles' mind, pain and death became parts of a ritual, a method of asserting his own power when everything else in his life was collapsing. From a heroic teenager to a decadent nobleman, then a squanderer of wealth, Gilles now stood at the edge of a bottomless abyss. Every step in his life at this time seemed pulled by an invisible force, the force of desperation, greed, and the warped belief that fate would change if only he found the right ritual, the right incantation, or the right demon to answer his call. But what awaited him below was not gold, prosperity, or miracles. What awaited him was the very darkness inside him. A darkness that had grown alongside the violence of his childhood, the warfare of his youth, and the collapse of his adult life. And as Gilles took one step further, the last boundary between man and monster would vanish entirely. The downfall was no longer a backdrop. It became the direct cause that led Gilles down the path of crime that history would remember forever. This stage was the point of descent, the moment when the final light left a man once hailed as a hero, and darkness became his only companion. From this point on, everything in Mashikal Castle would turn into a nightmare for an entire region. In this chapter, when one looks into the final ruins of Gilles de Rais's mind, one does not simply see a murderer stripped of humanity, but the intersection of three poisonous currents: war, absolute power, and a distorted psychological structure formed in childhood. These three forces, placed side by side, seem to have opened a road for a man to walk directly into darkness, not because he was born a monster, but because every condition around him helped shape him into a literal demon in European history. From a very young age, Gilles lived in an environment where blood and violence were not unfamiliar. His parents died early under tragic circumstances, his father in a sudden hunting accident, his mother not long after, leaving him in the hands of relatives who valued the authority of their lineage above any moral principle. The castle where Gilles grew up was not a home of affection, but an invisible pressure. A child of the de Rais family had to be strong, had to be ruthless, had to prove he belonged to a class beyond judgment. In those years, the boundary between power and morality blurred very early. Then came war. As only a teenager, Gilles stepped onto the battlefield of the 100 Years' War, where death pressed against every breath. He saw bodies piled in heaps, heard metal striking bone, and grew accustomed to the fact that a human life could be ended with a single swing. In such an environment, emotions froze, fear eroded, and life became cheap. Glory arrived too early, titles, lands, praise, convincing him that he was chosen by God. A young man celebrated for his ability to kill, adorned with the title of hero for destroying enemies, and honoured for fighting alongside Joan of Arc, would easily confuse the shine of medals with the darkness beneath them. But war did not only make him a hero in the public eye, it also carved a deep hole in his psychology. When the war ended, when the neighing of horses and the clash of armour faded into the past, Gilles lost the only purpose he had ever understood: to fight. There were no more enemies to destroy, no more crowds cheering, no more instant authority granted by the battlefield. He fell into an inner void he was incapable of filling, and that void, in the cruelest way, became fertile ground for darkness to ignite. Then came power. Gilles de Rais was a grand nobleman, holding more land, soldiers and privileges than most people in France. More importantly, he lived in a system where nobles were nearly above the law. A command from him could shape the fate of an entire peasant family. A burst of anger could cost a servant his life. No one dared oppose him. No one held the rank to restrain him. No one dared approach the secret world surrounding Machecoul Castle without permission. Such absolute power, placed in the hands of someone who had long lost a sense of moral limits, became the fuel that burned away the last remaining light in his mind. Gilles did not merely feel entitled to do anything. He believed he was right to do it. Power, war, and the feudal system created a sacred armour that prevented him from recognizing the horror of his own actions. And then came the third factor: psychological disorder. Though no modern diagnosis exists, historians who have spent years analysing his testimony, behaviour and personality all come to the conclusion that he displayed numerous traits consistent with narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. The signs appeared in the court records: pleasure in causing pain, excitement when victims begged, and a sense of thrill in killing, traits commonly seen in modern serial killers. But in the Middle Ages there were no psychiatrists, no therapy, no concept of a serial killer. Gilles was no exception. He was simply the final product of a chain of toxic conditions that medieval society had no tools to recognise. His enjoyment of controlling others, reinforced by war, fuelled by power, gradually became an addiction. And like all addicts, his threshold for stimulation rose. Killing enemies on the battlefield was no longer enough. Killing commoners offered no novelty. He needed his victims' fear, their desperate eyes, the feeling of absolute dominance when another person's life lay entirely in his hands. That was when the secret torture chambers appeared, when poor children, voiceless, unprotected, became the perfect targets. Every hallmark of a modern serial killer was present: choosing vulnerable victims, repeating the behaviour, escalating the brutality, constructing rituals and hiding bodies. Viewed through the lens of the 21st century, Gilles de Rais is clearly one of the first recorded serial killers in European history. But through the eyes of the 15th century, he was the product of three storms: a cold childhood, a war that ravaged his spirit, and a power that no one oversaw. And at that intersection, darkness found a body in which to dwell. Only when the truth finally surfaced and France trembled did people realise that sometimes monsters are not created by demons, but by medieval society itself, fed daily by war, privilege, and vast blind spots in morality. When the story of Gilles de Rais comes to a close, he's not remembered merely as an aberration, a monster who appeared without warning in the Middle Ages, but as a mirror reflecting the darkest nature of that age. For what happened around Machekal Castle was not an isolated nightmare. It was the product of a social order in which feudal power operated almost entirely without supervision, where war and extreme religious thinking carved moral voids wide enough for any crime to be hidden within. Gilles de Rais, once a national hero, a companion of Jeanne d'Arc, became the most notorious child killer of medieval Europe, and it is precisely this terrifying contrast that makes his story so haunting. When he stood before the court in 1440, he was the living embodiment of something people of that era rarely dared to imagine, that nobles could also be devils, lords, knights, the highborn elite, those regarded as the moral and military pillars of society, were suddenly exposed in a completely different light. Gilles not only committed crimes, he exploited the status and reverence society granted him to construct a perfect veil for years of horrifying acts. What makes his legacy so heavy is the silence, a silence that stretched from peasants to priests, from servants to nobles. No one dared oppose a lord who was wealthy, militarily distinguished, and favoured by the royal court. No one thought that a man who had fought beside the heroine of France, Jeanne d'Arc, could inflict atrocities upon the children of his own lands. For years, the solitary cries that vanished within the thick walls of Machekal Castle were nothing more than faint echoes, drowned out by the sound of hooves, drunken feasts, and the indifference of the age. That legacy, a corruption left unchecked, is what keeps the story of Gilles de Rais alive even now. For when we look back, we see that without blind faith in the nobility, without a feudal structure that favoured unilateral power, without war numbing the collective conscience, his crimes might have been uncovered far earlier. But medieval society was one that explained everything through God's will, blamed misfortune on demons, and bowed deeply before those of high birth. And in those very blind spots, a man like Gilles could nurture every shadow within himself without encountering a single boundary. The bitterest point lies in this. When he was finally arrested, when every secret was dragged into the light, the horror felt by the people did not come from the number of victims or the brutality of the acts. What terrified them most was the realization that a nobleman, someone expected to embody virtue, was the perpetrator of unimaginable deeds. For them, this almost shattered the spiritual structure of feudal society. If a lord could do such things, then who was left to trust? Even today, historians still debate. Did medieval society create Gilles de Rais, or merely conceal him for too long? There is no simple answer. But the fragments of history suggest that both are true. War created the conditions in which violence could take root. Feudal power nurtured arrogance and the belief in being above the law. The worship of nobility blinded communities, and perhaps most importantly, the absence of any concept of a serial killer meant that suspicious signs were dismissed as peculiar tales instead of warnings of a tragedy unfolding. The execution of Gilles de Rais in 1440 closed the darkest chapter of his life, but it did not close the larger question that history continues to whisper. Had he lived in modern times, would he have become a serial killer at all, or would he have been detected earlier and stopped? Some argue that had he not been a nobleman, he would have been punished long before. Others believe that a fairer legal system might have saved at least one child, but the Middle Ages offer none of these hypotheticals. They leave us with a harsher truth. Absolute power can kill the human soul more swiftly than any demon. And that is why the name of Gilles de Rais never fades, not because of his brutality alone, but because he is the clearest reminder that evil does not always wear horns or bat wings. Sometimes it wears shining armour, carries a hero's title, and is celebrated by an entire kingdom. As we conclude this chapter, we leave Mashekul Castle with a tightness in the chest. Those stone walls witnessed more horror than any battlefield, and that truth alone makes the legacy of Gilles de Rais significant, not as a blood-soaked legend, but as a profound lesson about power, morality, and the responsibility of society. Only by recognizing the darkness of the past can we understand how to keep similar darkness from rising again in the future. And now, sleep well, and look forward to the next stories on Medieval Dreams.